Alright, welcome back to a video updating this collection of VHS DVDs, games, and more. Today we're going to be starting off part 2 of my September 2022 VHS collection, which I have 95 VHSs, which is good. It's going to be freaking epic. Now let's get on to the video. Starting off in part 2 is Buzzers Boys. That works totally fine with no issues whatsoever. Print date is August 28th, 1994. Next up is Robin and Marion. That works totally fine with no issues whatsoever, and print date is the 10th week of 1998. Next up is the 2 cassettes of Titanic. That works totally fine with no issues whatsoever, and print date is the 34th week of 1998, which is actually the same print date as Blue's Clues and Storytime, which I showed you in the previous part. Next up is The Wedding Singer. That works totally fine with no issues whatsoever. Print date is June 27th, 1998. Next up is The Mummy. That works totally fine with no issues whatsoever. And print date is the 33rd week of 1999. Next up is Blue's Clues and Blue's Big Treasure Hunt. That works totally fine with no issues whatsoever. Print date is the 33rd week of 1999. Next up is Big Daddy that I'm going to get on DVD in the future. Works totally fine with no issues whatsoever. And print date is the 40th week of 1999. On the Blockbuster thing, it told you that it's gotten on January 24, 2000. Next up is the Saving Private Ryan 2 video set. This top thing got taken off because it's falling apart. Both tapes work totally fine with no issues whatsoever. Print date is the first tape here on September 3rd, 1999, whereas this tape here on September 4th, 1999. And this piece here fell off, and this is going to be the last time you're going to be seeing it. Next up is my Legendary Videos Everest. That works totally fine with no issues whatsoever, and print date is April 9th, 1999. Next up is Pokemon 2000. Pokemon the movie 2000. That works totally fine with no issues whatsoever, and print date is September 23rd, 2000. Next up is Deep Blue Sea. That works totally fine with no issues whatsoever. Print date is November 20th, 1999. Next up is Blue's Clues and Blue Safari. That works totally fine with no issues whatsoever, and print date is the 50th week of 1999. Next up is the Shawshank Redemption. That works totally fine with no issues whatsoever. Print date is August 4th, 2001. Next up is The Mummy Returns, a Blockbuster video. That works totally fine with no issues whatsoever. Print date is the 36th week of 2001. Next up is Hope Floats. That works totally fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Dr. Dolittle 2. That works totally fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Murder by Numbers, which is rated R. Works totally fine with no issues whatsoever. And print date is August 14, 2002 and November 31st, 2001. 2 print dates for this video. Next up is Walt Disney's The Rookie. That works totally fine with no issues whatsoever. It's featured in my August 2018 video cassette collection, my August 2018 VHS collection. Print date is July 17th, 2002. Next up is my first widescreen video cassette, Gone. That works totally fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is American Idol. That works totally fine with no issues whatsoever. Lastly for the slipcases is Madagascar. That works totally fine with no issues whatsoever. It's my newest video, by the way. Print date is September 26, 2005. Now let's move on to caseless video cassettes, starting from the oldest and stuff. Before we go to the caseless one, I forgot to show that this is Dodge City. That works totally fine with no issues whatsoever. Here are the last of the video cassettes, which are the caseless video cassettes. Starting with is Disorder in the Court, The Three Stooges. That works totally fine, even though the top is missing, causing the film strip to be a little damaged. Next up is this Christmas video cassette that works totally fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Revenge of the Nerds 2, The Next Generation, that works totally fine with no issues whatsoever, and print date is the 11th week of 1993. Next up is that Doran Cat that works totally fine, even though it has a little bit of bad picture in it. Next up is 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, that works totally fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is My Heroes Have Always Been Cowboys. That works totally fine with no issues whatsoever. There's a print date right here. Print date is July 12th, 1991. Yeah, it's really old, by the way. Next up is the Michael Landon tribute. That works totally fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Problem Child 2. That works totally fine with no issues whatsoever. And print date is the 45th week of 1991. Next up is the commercial copy of Rosanna and Old Lace. That works totally fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Brave, last name with Mel Gibson. That works totally fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Legally Blonde. That works totally fine with no issues whatsoever. Print date is September 19th, 2001, which is the 10th anniversary of the Michael Landon tribute video. Next up is the Flintstones movie. That works totally fine with no issues whatsoever. Print date is the 38th week of 1994. Next up is my second Casper video that works totally fine with no issues whatsoever. Print date is the 48th week of 1995. Next up is The Crow that works totally fine with no issues whatsoever. If my camera will focus. Print date is August 31st, 1994. Next up is the 10 Commandments that work totally fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is the TV All Times Family Favorites that works totally fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is the People vs. Larry Flint that works totally fine with no issues whatsoever. Print date is the 19th week of 1997. Next up is a Walton Wedding that works totally fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is Rugrats, The Sandy Experience that works totally fine even though it sounds a little off. Print date is the 43rd week of 1999, even though it is a 1998 copy. Next up is Jingle All the Way. It's going to have some microphone issues due to the performance. Works totally fine with no issues whatsoever. Yeah, no issues whatsoever. Print date is the 48th week of 1997. Next up is Lake Placid that works totally fine with no issues whatsoever. Print date is the 26th week of 2000, even though it is a 1999 video. Next up, it's got to be one of the rarest tape ever I have in my collection. Joyride in a blue tape that works totally fine with no issues whatsoever. Next up is One Life to Live / Long Road Home 1991 that works totally fine, even though I've accidentally added Curious George onto the video, but it's alright right now because I do have this episode now on this video in case my Curious George Unite stopped working. Next up is Animal that works totally fine with no issues whatsoever. Print date is the 39th week of 2001. And last but not least is Too Fast, Too Furious. That works totally fine with no issues whatsoever. Print date is the 35th week of 2003. Now that's going to do me with 2 parts to my September 2022 VHS collection containing 95 video cassettes. This is Davian's collection of VHS DVDs, games, and more. Thank you for watching. I hope you like, subscribe, and comment, and I'll see you again in my next video.